Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Wildlife Studies Wild Chronicles webinar. And thank you all for joining in today. CWS regularly hosts such webinars regarding topics related to wildlife biology and conservation. And if you'd like to see any of our past webinars, you can go to our website and look under a series titled Wild Chronicles. Today, we are going to talk about human and crocodile communities and the involvement of crocodiles in our cultures, our traditions, and our belief systems. And today we have Romulus Whitaker and Simon Pooley with us. And I'm sure everyone knows about them and they don't need an introduction. But before we start, I'd like to briefly talk about their work. Simon is currently the Lambert Lecturer in Environment and Program Director of MC in the Department of Geography at the University of London. And his work focuses on human-wildlife coexistence, and he continues to study wildfires, bioinnovations, and interdisciplinarity. Ram is truly an inspirational figure who has made an invaluable contribution to wildlife research and nature conservation in India, especially with herpetofaunal perspective. He has written scores of technical papers and a number of books, and also directed and produced wildlife documentaries. He has co-founded the Madras Crocodile Bank Trust for Herpetology, which is India's largest reptile conservation research and education center. I would like to thank both Ram and Simon for joining us today. Before we start our discussion, just a small housekeeping note. If anyone from the participants has a question for Ram or Simon, you can please send it to us in the chat box, and we'll direct it to Ram and Simon by the end of this talk. Before we start, I would like to briefly ask both of you how you got initially interested in the field of herpetology and human-reptile relationships, starting with Ram.
Oh boy, it kind of goes back. I'm not going to even tell you how many years, but I was about 5 years old in northern New York State when I started collecting snakes, and I have to blame my mother for encouraging me. So this fascination never went away. It started with snakes and then evolved into reptiles. And as far as the human element goes, it was pretty obvious that people didn't like snakes on the whole. And I sort of used my interest in snakes as the proselytizer about how nice they were. I was probably a very obnoxious little kid trying to tell adults how nice snakes are when everyone knew damn well they're horrible creatures. And then it has sort of evolved into crocodiles, because when I started the Madras Snake Park in 1970, I was given a small grant from the Bombay Natural History Society to do some surveys around India. So the early 1970s is when I visited places like the Chambal and other places in the Gir forest in Gujarat and the Sundarbans, and I was able to do some surveys, and I was shocked that crocodiles were really on their way out. The gharial in particular was on the edge of just about going extinct, and we had to do something about it. So it was then when all the work that I subsequently did, it started with that, just the shock of seeing these animals almost on the verge of extinction. So that's how it started.
Okay. And over to you, Simon.
Yeah, so I kind of had no choice. I grew up on crocodile research facilities in Zululand in South Africa. So my father, Tony, like Rom, was one of the kind of founder figures in the IUCN Crocodile Specialist Group. So he was doing kind of pioneering work up there on Nile crocodile breeding ecology and conservation. So I kind of grew up counting crocodile eggs, and we had hatchlings in the bath. When the floods came up, the croc farm was down on the edge of the floodplain. So when the floods came up, the water would go over the fence. So we'd bring the hatchlings up to the house until the water went down, and then take them back down the hill. So I grew up, catching crickets and things and putting them in there. So I helped net fish for the crocs, I guess. And when I was older, Dad would take us along to capture problem animals. So I saw quite a lot of also the damage that crocodiles can do. But at that time, crocs were really being shot out. And as Ron was saying, in South Africa, there was a unregulated hunting outside of protected areas, and numbers were really, really down. And I guess there were lots of other reptiles around. You know, we had skinks and lizards and geckos in the house, and all kinds of snakes. Brown house snake lived in my father's shoe that he left outside, his shoes outside at night. There were a lot of more venomous snakes. So we had an Egyptian cobra living in one corner of the house, which was removed. We had black and green mambas. So there were those kind of snakes. So I think, as Ron was saying, one thing that really struck me was the response to reptiles. So the very strong responses people have to reptiles, to snakes and crocodiles. So that's something I've been interested in for a long time. And I'm also kind of drawn to the underdog a little bit in some respects. You know, I was surrounded by all these conservationists, looking after the lion and the elephant and these great and noble romantic animals. And you can, get funded doing that stuff, but good luck getting funding for the old reptile, the cold-blooded ones. So that was interesting. And my father and me and my career have spent a lot of time trying to figure out, how do people understand, how do they respond to reptiles, and how can you work with this? What can you learn from it? How can you work around it, I guess. So, yeah, that was my...
Can I interject here just for 1 second?
Yeah, sure.
Because when Simon mentions his dad, Tony, Tony was one of our mentors. I mean, even though he was over in South Africa and here we were in South India, we collected our first batch of crocodile eggs and we really didn't know how to incubate them. In fact, we got a shock when he wrote a letter saying, do not turn the egg over, mark it on top, because you can kill the embryo by flipping it. And I said, oh my God, we were handling them so carelessly. So then we sort of handled them as though they were full of nitroglycerin, Make a little X mark on top and put it carefully into the box to incubate them. So Tony was, in fact, an incredible mentor to us. And between all the snail mail correspondence that we did, he taught us a heck of a lot. Almost everything we knew about how to hatch crocodile eggs.
It's a great connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. But really fascinating childhood stories, Simon, and I'm feeling jealous now. Before we delve into the intriguing relationship between human and crocodile communities, I would want to ask Simon about the importance of looking at human cultures and traditions when we're talking about human non-human relationships, specifically because in your recent chapter titled Culture and Wildlife in the IUCN and SSC guidelines on human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, you, along with your colleagues, suggest that understanding culture can enhance the understanding of human-wildlife conflict. And I'd like to request you to please expand a little more on this and also why you feel this way.
It's a big question. So I should say that it actually wasn't easy to get this onto the agenda. So we were a task force and we were looking at human-wildlife conflict. But traditionally in conservation, this is always oriented to interventions, separations, dealing with the animals, telling people what they can and can't do, preventing, this sort of thing, changing people's behavior. So it was a little bit of work to say, well, if we're talking about humans and wildlife interactions, then surely we need to talk about culture. There's also a linked chapter in the guidelines on history, because essentially human-wildlife conflict is about, the conflicts are between people mainly, about what to do about negative impacts of wildlife, by crocodile bites or destruction of nets and these sorts of things. And this is when culture becomes so important, because it's so varied how people understand and explain traumatic things like crocodile attacks. So I guess it's a bit more obvious maybe to those of us who've grown up in landscapes where people feel that they walk among spirits and ancestors, who feel that animals are maybe part of the spiritual and moral landscape. Perhaps less so when you're sitting, where we were sitting having this discussion in Oxford, many of us biologists. So I think it was just something that needed introducing into the conversation. And the thing is that, many people don't experience these impressive species primarily as biological animals. They understand them symbolically as cultural animals. And we all have that in different ways, whether it's someone who grew up doing biology in the UK who had this romantic idea about working with lions. We all have our constructions. So that's the other thing about culture. Everyone's got it, right? It's not like you talk often in a room with biologists and they talk about culture. They mean people living somewhere in the global south, indigenous people, and they forget they have their own culture and cultures. So I guess, and you can really get this wrong. You can go in there and say, oh, right, I'm a conservationist. People are getting attacked by an animal. There's human-wildlife conflict. Well, maybe, but you should check with the locals. Maybe it's not a conflict for them. So there are situations where it really directly impacts on what you do as a manager. And it can be difficult. There's research by Sebastian Brackhain and others in East Timor, where sometimes people think crocodile attacks are, you cannot respond to that. You cannot remove or kill that crocodile because it's an ancestor crocodile. Those crocodiles, they actually believe generally don't attack. Other people are killed by messenger crocodiles who are sent for a reason to punish somebody. Other crocodiles are, maybe they swam over from Australia. Well, you can do what you like with those crocodiles. That's complicated, right? So as managers, you need to try and figure out, Aboriginals and folk in Australia have repeatedly asked conservation officials not to kill a crocodile, even though it's killed somebody. That's a significant crocodile. The person did something stupid. There's different interpretations. So Rom, I'm sure, can speak to this about India, and I've done a little bit of work in Gujarat and Papua New Guinea, another fascinating place. And so just one other thing I wanted to say, of course, about cultures is they change. And I think that's something you're going to pick on later, so I'm not going to go into that. But when you talk about cultural stuff, people always tend to look backwards into the past. What can we learn? This unchanging, I see this a lot about work on Africa, it's unchanging. Well, no, it's not. And you also need to think about what people imagine their future is, as well as looking backwards. The other thing to say about culture is it requires lots of different sorts of methods, thinking about ethics, respectful listenings, and these are in some ways new things. At least for conservation biology, they are new things. So this is stuff that we're figuring out. There are people who do this. So finally, just we can also learn maybe from cultural studies, we can learn about where people coexist as well as help us understand problem situations. So instead of always framing this, as we initially did in our group, as a problem and a conflict, it's interesting to think about the places where people, like in Gujarat, some parts, not others, people do coexist. Well, what could we learn? So culture is important in that way as well, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Very true. And the point you raised about culture's change, that's something I'm also very fascinated by. And we will touch upon that later during the discussion. But I'd like to ask Ram, specifically with the Indian context, how different cultures have historically viewed crocodiles, and how do you think cultural beliefs and practices influence human-crocodile relationships, in your opinion?
Well, there's two ways of looking at this. For one thing, in general, compared to the West, we in India are the most tolerant people of deadly animals in the world. And we put up with them until they perhaps cross a certain boundary, and then perhaps they have to be killed. So we both worship and kill snakes, crocodiles, and even rats. So it's a strange dichotomy, a wonderful dichotomy, and a very complex one. And if you look across India, you just mentioned Gujarat, where the goddess Kodiyar, she could be called a folk goddess, and perhaps more mainline is Ma Ganga. Both of them are astride crocodiles, and in the case of Ma Ganga, sometimes astride a gharial, but in this case, it's a crocodile. And this is quite a nice little piece of, actually, this came from Madhya Pradesh, and you can find many representations of Ma Ganga in, various paintings and statues in temples and so on. Varuna, the rain god, rides on Makara. Makara is a sort of composite crocodile fish, and perhaps a few other animals thrown in. Even Kamadeva, the god of love, has a crocodile as his emblem. And even Hanuman gets grabbed by a crocodile, and he pulls it out and it turns into a beautiful maiden. So you can go through a lot of Hindu literature, sacred literature, and pull out all sorts of interesting crocodile references. Now, how that equates, or how that comes down to the ground reality of how people deal with things are definitely changing, and not for the better. People are getting a little bit, tired of putting up with. Well, for example, we started. I may be held responsible for helping to start crocodile conservation in India, since we were collecting thousands of crocodile eggs and hatching them and then supplying them to various parts of the country. And we supplied crocodiles to places where they were released back to the wild, to protected areas, true. But these are protected areas used by people, and for a whole generation or two, they had no experience with crocodiles, and they had no tradition of how to deal with them. So naturally, there are going to be problems, and we see this problem today. And you're very much aware of it in your Gujarat experience. As Simon said, certain parts of Gujarat, the Charotar area, is fine. People are getting along beautifully with them. Other areas, however, no, not at all. In fact, there are probably more attacks in the state of Gujarat than any other part of India. When I first went to Sri Lanka a long time ago, I did a survey there in 1977, and a motorbike survey of the entire country over a 40-day period. It was a fantastic experience. And I saw more crocodiles than I could even imagine. And I saw ladies washing their clothes, and next to them there would be a crocodile basking. And we interviewed people, the people who spoke Tamil anyway, because I didn't speak Sinhala. And we were able to get some very interesting stories from them, saying, no, the crocodiles don't bother us, we don't bother them. And that was such an eye-opener, because these are large predatory animals. How could this happen? So that was something, fantastic lesson for me. So, I'm not sure where to go with this, but the fact is that we are very tolerant of the most dangerous animals in India. And this is a very positive thing, which is getting eroded by the fact that people are just not putting up with it anymore. So, that's the situation as it stands right now.
Yeah, that's very true, Ram. And also, do you think that we know very few such places similar to Charotar, where crocodiles and humans are coexisting? It's also because of maybe that inherent bias towards studying the negative interactions, and that's why these places are not being reported in literature. Because now, since I have started this work, I have been hearing about such places from across India where people are living with crocodiles, they're sharing the space and resources, and there are very few negative interactions. recently I came across this article which talked about Maharashtra, a place in Maharashtra where people swim with crocodiles in river, which is a neighboring state of Gujarat.
Right.
And yeah, and even in Gujarat, there are so many other sites in northern Gujarat, such as, for instance, if you look at Kutch, there are so many crocodiles and they live alongside humans. And
Yeah.
still, we don't know anything about the histories of these coexistence. And I really feel we should document this.
Yeah, and talking about documenting, someone who is a good writer and a collector of these things should start looking at old gazetteers, for example. I just by accident pulled up a Mysore gazetteer from 1926, and the British commissioner writes, yes, crocodiles are quite common in the Calvary River and its tributaries. However, they don't seem to cause any problem except taking occasional livestock. But this is a real eye-opener. You would expect a commissioner at that time to be out there with his gun, sort of shooting every crocodile that was reported. But he had quite a few nice things to say about them, which I was very surprised to see.
Yeah. So since Ram also mentioned about that situation is changing now, and there are very few places such as Charotar where everything seems to be working fine. But I also feel that what if these crocodile population increase and they move out to different areas where people have never lived with crocodiles before.
Right.
And this begs the question of individuality. And I would like to ask Simon about his paper, Culture Herpetology of Nile Crocodiles, where you talk about the relationships between human communities and individual crocodiles. And can you please expand a little more on this and how this is useful in our context?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I did a survey of historical human-croc interactions across Africa. So that's mainly with the large biting ones. So Niloticus and now Crocodilus sucus, the West African crocodile, which they're still just about to publish the survey assessment of. And what's interesting is European writers, anyway, travelers, they attribute variability in character and behavior to the mammals. But they almost universally assume that crocodiles don't have this because they see them as primitive in evolutionary terms. So you've got this caricature of crocodiles as these kind of mindless killing machines. They, dull reptilian brains, basically species bias, if you like. There are rare exceptions. There's a famous crocodile called Lutembe, who was a sort of local celebrity on Lake Victoria in what's now Uganda. People used to go and she used to come out of the water and take a fish if you gave her the fish, but she was definitely wild. There was a guy who used to call her and feed him, and one day he decided this was becoming a tourist thing, and he tried to sit on her, and she grabbed him by the arm and dunked him just to say, listen, back off, buddy. I'll come and take my fish, but that's as far as it goes. So there were local legends about her. But certainly, on the other hand, Africans definitely recognized individual agency, but in several ways. So one of those was particular relationships that were believed to exist between sorcerers and their familiars, so the sort of were-crocodile. So this is two different ways. The crocodile, in some respects, this is more rare. A person could sort of become crocodile and go and do bad things. More usually, the crocodile would be the agent, which would go and do bad things on behalf of this person. But Africans would say this was a particular crocodile then. This was not all crocodiles. So it's quite difficult to work out. So the Azende, for example, would say there are the sort of normal crocs, the pedestrian, biological, whatever crocs. And then there are these occasional other kinds of mysterious crocodiles. And so one thing about that is that you would identify so-called problem crocs. So people wouldn't generalize. They wouldn't say, well, if someone was killed, they wouldn't say, well, we should kill all crocodiles because they kill people. which is what the Western response generally was. Okay, crocodiles attacked someone, we should kill all crocodiles. Crocodiles could be messengers of their ancestors, so they could be sent to punish people who'd not respected their ancestors or who'd done bad things. Some communities had special totemic relationships with crocodiles, the Bakwena and other people like that, and they believed that their people were safe from attack. On Madagascar, some people believe the souls of important ancestors reside in large crocodiles, so you obviously can't kill such an animal. But again, beliefs vary from community to community. You might have a clan on one side of the river that said crocodiles must not be harmed, there's a sacred relationship. And then on the other side, they would hunt them and eat them. And so sometimes you got quite pragmatic things going on. So if there was a crocodile eating your livestock, but you were from the side of the river that said you can't kill crocodiles, well, what you might do is hire someone from the other side to to do the job for you. So there's a certain amount of pragmatism, let's say, that went on. And I saw this in as you know very well, Yashendu and Rom in Gujarat. So I spoke with people who had pictures of Kodiar on their home, and they'd had a relative killed. And some of those people would say, oh, yes, we don't want anything to happen to the crocodile because of Kodiar. Someone else would have a picture of Kodiar and they would say, no, we want the crocodiles gone. It's sort of metaphoric. There's no direct relationship between Kodiar and these crocodiles. We don't want these crocodiles. Can you take them away? I think the final thing to say, I guess, is for anyone who's actually lived with crocodiles, there are definite variations in individual temperament and behavior. I mean, we had some very larger than life crocodile characters that I grew up with. And they're intelligent, they learn, they remember things, they can remember people, particular people. And they also learn to live around people, as I believe has happened in certain village ponds in Gujarat. I think certain crocodiles have actually learned how to live around people, whereas perhaps arguably more transient crocs in the rivers haven't. And I was interested in your comment about rivers, Yashendu, because what struck me in Gujarat was that it was really along the rivers where there was what I would call conflict. And
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, that's very true. But also, before moving on, I'd like to ask you about identifying individuals and in your experience in Africa, how do people identify individuals? Is it just based on morphology? Because what I have observed in central Gujarat is that people also are able to not identify all individuals, but classify all individuals into two groups based on their behavior, and not just based on the morphology. So, how in your experience in Africa, people used to identify individuals?
That's very interesting, and I haven't done enough research on this, but it will be behavior. It'll be, for example, Mankainkai, a very large crocodile that we captured. He used to hang out at the crossing, Mankainkai's crossing, because that's where he could catch. He had a bad donkey habit, but that's where he could catch livestock and possibly people. So there were crocodiles that frequented certain places where people or livestock were. People knew a little bit about mothers and nests, so where you would get charged going along the riverbank. I'd say I'm not at all confident that, and I'm generalizing from what I know, I'm not at all confident that people could, differentiate all the crocodiles in their area. Absolutely not. They would, often the larger end, they would know those crocodiles and distinct coloring, those sorts of things. For Nile crocodiles, particularly dark or particularly yellow colored crocodiles might be recognized.
Yeah. There's a point that comes to mind when we're talking about individual crocodiles and crocodiles' behavior toward people and vice versa. It seems that crocodiles are causing problems where people caused problems for a crocodile. I'm being very generalistic here, and I'm not doing it on the basis of research, but I just use leopards as an example, for example, because that's the animal which is being captured and translocated like mad all over the country every single day. I live in a place called Mysore here in South India. Every day in the newspaper, a leopard is caught and translocated and dropped back to the forest. He's taken from a sugarcane field and popped back to the forest. He's in the forest where there are existing populations of adult leopards. He's going to get the hell out of there. He's never been in the forest in his life. He's lived in this open, rural landscape all his life, or her life. And the chances are he or she will try to get back and cause problems on the way. This is causing a problem to an animal which is, I'm not going to say seeking revenge or taking revenge or anything like that, but it seems to me that crocodiles, as you say, are intelligent animals. They do remember things. And if they're given a hard time, chances are they'll give a hard time back.
Yeah.
Yeah, very true. So adding on to that, Ram, I'd like to ask you about the co-evolution of human and crocodile behavior, because when I was working in Gujarat, some people used to, especially the fisher folk, they used to touch the crocodiles and remove them out of their nets. And when I asked them that, how are you doing this? And especially because they are also like 5 feet deep in water. And they'll swim inside the pond and they'll release the crocodiles from the nets. And I asked them, how do you do this? And how do you know that crocodile won't attack you back? So one person told me that I have been doing this for the last 20 years. And I know that if I touch a crocodile here, then crocodile will grunt. I know that if I touch a crocodile here, the crocodile will get angry. But I know that if I touch here, then probably the crocodile won't do anything. So I think there is a behavioral adaptation from humans as well as crocodiles. And this is purely inductive. And I'd like to also ask you to maybe possibly illustrate a few more examples of this phenomenon. Maybe you can start with that story you told me about your experience with Geed, where crocodiles were afraid of khaki clothes, but not of mulberry clothes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's again something pretty obvious that when I was trying to do surveys in the Gir forest in Kamleshwar Lake, or also called Hiran Lake, where there was quite a big population of mugger, and perhaps still is. When I first arrived there and I popped my head around a tree to try to get a closer look at crocodiles, they all just dove into the water. And at the same time, I watched a Maldari herding his buffalo right down next to the water's edge, and the crocs hardly even moved. I said, wait a minute, something's happening here. So I borrowed a turban and a white kurta. And okay, I couldn't do much about my white skin, but at least I had the right turban, and it worked. It was really very helpful. And I mean, I know that people who are hunters have told me the same thing. They'll use a bullet cart to get close to blackbuck, and they get a close shot. Otherwise, the blackbuck would get away pretty quick. So certainly, yeah, you can, fall into the what's a regular routine that the crocodiles don't get frightened of and get close to them. Very definitely.
Yeah, and I'm sure. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Simon.
No, just very briefly to exactly that point, Rom. When my father started trying to observe crocodiles on Lake Nyamiti, he built a hide and the crocs never came out. And then eventually he abandoned it and he just went and sat in a rock in the same place every day. And eventually they got used to him and they ignored him eventually when they decided he was all right.
Yeah, they teach us.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure both Simon and Rom, about some individuals in Charotar that allows people to go very close to them, which is really fascinating.
Well,
Yeah.
you also, I can't remember which South American country it was in, but until a few years ago, this guy was playing with an American crocodile, a huge male. And it was just unbelievable, the stuff he was doing with this animal. And it was quite a sad story, ultimately, the croc dies and so on. But he said, I believe the story went that it was wounded and he looked after it. It had been shot and he looked after it and even as an adult, this crocodile was totally calm with him, and
Yeah.
he was taking liberties like I couldn't imagine I ever doing anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
was
but
great.
thanks. Yeah, no, but thanks a lot for touching upon that point, Rom, because
Mm.
it perfectly leads into my next question about animal agency. And we know that animals are exercising agency across the globe, but how do we respond to this as managers? Because if I take a couple of examples, let's say there was a walrus in Norway, and
Mm.
that individual was completely fine with humans, but then authorities shot it because of potential hazard. There was a Saras crane in India, in Uttar
Yeah.
Pradesh, where the crane was very close to a human, and the authorities took the crane away, and maybe
Right.
it made both of them sad. But so I would like to ask both Ram and Simon about crocodile agency, especially let's say in Charotar, if crocodiles are fine with humans, and if humans are fine with crocodiles, then how do we sort of deal with this situation as managers? Because you never know what's going to happen
Yeah.
in future.
That's very true. Well, it's a question of educating our forest department as well, isn't it? Because almost all the problems that are like the one I just pointed out that talks about leopards, for example, it all has to do with the attitude of the forest department. And when you have a good, intelligent senior officer who can be shown and that something really works, that's the time to, grab a hold of that person and do the best you can. But unfortunately, there are officers who are totally blind to that and have the old mindset of dangerous animals should not be around humans, and that's where problems arise.
Mm.
I hope Charotar continues to be as it is now, because it's just wonderful. It's a wonderful example.
Mm. I think that's right. I think what's hard for managers, Rom, often is not acting. And managers want to act. They want to manage. They want to get in there and do something and solve it. And I always say to my colleagues, it's much easier to study human wildlife conflict because you can count this stuff. It's all the attacks, right? Coexistence is much harder because it's when things don't happen. It's when the crocodile doesn't bite someone or the person doesn't kill the crocodile. So what are you counting? It's a different mindset, how we study this stuff. And I think for managers as well, of course, there's always the potential for things to go wrong. I mean, I interviewed a fascinating guy in Anand they'd lost their only daughter to a crocodile, and they'd lived peacefully for generations around this pond, and people still do. But she'd gone in, she'd dropped a pot, she'd probably stepped on it, and it grabbed her. It didn't eat her, but it did what maybe a croc will do on reflex, grabbed her, pulled her under, and then released her. But she drowned and she died. It was a very serious event. So what do you do? Fortunately, the forest department did sort of try and go in there and shoot all the crocodiles. And of course, the problem is which crocodile. They think they know which one it is. But again, they did what you say, what they did with leopard. They grabbed this thing, they take it off to Purry Edge wetland and release it. And then literally on my way to the airport, a local guy, a really brilliant naturalist, Vishal Mistry, he sent me a picture of they'd recaptured this thing on making its way home. Of course it was in somebody's field, and they'd phoned up and said, can you catch it? So, not a helpful intervention right there.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. And
Can I just say, sorry,
Yeah.
Yashendu, can I just say, there is a consideration here with the rescuers, I think, because some of these guys probably are really experienced handlers. And of course a lot of them do it. They want to be on social media and whatever. It would not be good if people started to think, oh yeah, I can do that. Let me rescue this crocodile, or let me rescue this snake.
Yeah.
Particularly if it's a very venomous one. People don't necessarily know. So I do think there are management concerns. And I think what I saw that was interesting was that because there are no real big protected areas there, the forestry department don't seem to majorly feel that's what they do. So most of the problem animals are in fact handled by informal groups and sort of little NGOs and things.
Sure.
And some of what these guys do, of course, is helpful. Some of those animals don't need rescuing at all. So it's, and some of them, you know, there's a bit of feeding and sorts of things going on which are not exactly legal. So yeah, there are management concerns when people are handling these animals, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And this non-governmental rescue, that's the whole thing that's going on there, especially in central Gujarat. I think it also provides people a heightened social status, and maybe that's why like more and more people are joining these groups every year. But I would like to move the direction of our discussion a little, and then and to talk about what Jadek et al. Recently discussed in their paper titled Social Extinction of Species, where they talk about extinction of experiences. And since Simon, you mentioned earlier as well that cultures change and they are going to change in future. So how do you think that extinction of experiences can have an impact on contemporary as well as future interactions with crocodiles?
Do you want us both to answer?
Starting with Simon.
Okay, well, so something I've seen very much where I grew up and do research, and also we've seen this in colleagues of mine who work on lions in East Africa, is that the quite deep-seated cultural tolerance of animals has changed because people have become converted to Christianity, and they have lost that cultural link, and they have no relationship. In fact, it's often seen as something regressive. You know, if you believe in spirits and ancestors, that's wrong, and that's a real problem actually. So there's links have been broken. Now I don't know what you can do about that. I mean, honestly, but I think the one interesting case here has been the Philippines. So the Philippine crocodile was one of the most endangered crocodiles, still is. There's about 100 of them in the wild still, but essentially people had given up on them and said, listen, it's tri-age, we just got to forget it. They'll never survive in the wild. And partly because it was assumed that Filipinos hate crocodiles because they become a symbol of corruption and greed. But this was assumed to be a cultural view, and it was wrongly assumed to be a cultural view because a bunch of anthropologists working with locals up where there still are Philippine crocodiles realized there's actually a very long and deep history, cultural history, respectful relationship with crocodiles. So that sort of negative one, it was a sort of mainstream media thing, and it was held by people who didn't live with crocodiles anymore. So to your point on it really changes things when people are no longer living in proximity with animals. And that can be in two ways. It can be sort of romantic, you know, people who live in Scandinavian cities who have a great romance about wolves and want there to be wolves, as opposed to farmers who have wolves and are less keen on them. It can be that way, but it can also very much be that people forget, as Rom said, people forget how to live safely with animals, and they also forget that you can live safely with animals. And I do think that experiential dimension is very, very important with animals like crocodiles. You know, if you're around them and what they're doing, the VNC in Vijayanagar Nature Club, what they're doing with getting people out there and, you know, doing field surveys and getting people familiar with how the important role in the ecology, that they're not just going to sort of, crocs aren't going to run after you and try and eat you. I think that's really important stuff. That kind of exposure, obviously safe exposure, I think that's really important, but also celebrating this kind of thing's important. Celebrating, recognizing coexistence, building on cultural a respect and tolerance if it's there. I think all of those things are important. We need to write about this stuff. We need to talk about this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Stories to be told, and these are the stories that perhaps they don't make it into conservation journals, right? They don't make it into conservation biology very easily. It's like Current Conservation does a great job on telling these kinds of stories. Janaki's stories in the media. This is the kind of thing that's, I think, really important to share.
Yeah. In addition to that, we, as some of you probably know, we have a long-term gharial telemetry project going on in the Chambal River, led by Jeff Lang, who's probably, I would call him one of the world's top croc biologists.
Yeah.
And he's been following crocs for 15 years on the Chambal. And a big part of the program is to community involvement, because invariably when a gharial is caught to put a radio on, gangs of people come. So there's a fantastic opportunity for getting questions from people. Everyone has a question, and telling people why it's so important to look after the gharial. And it means the survival of the river, and everyone is dependent on the river who lives there. I mean, this is one of the driest parts of the country. So the Chambal River it's an unholy river, thank God. So they don't usually dump dead bodies into it this kind of thing. So the Chambal River is surviving largely, to some degree anyway, that because of the research that's going on there. So it's really important to the whole community involvement part of it.
Yeah, and I think both Ram and Simon rightly pointed out that a lot of people in Gujarat and outside, both Ram and Simon themselves, are working on ways to sort of inhibit the extension of experiences between local communities and the animals around them. And we know that personal experiences matter a lot when we talk about how perceptions and attitudes are shaped, which in turn drive our actions towards animals. So this is a really important factor when we talk about conservation and management of crocodiles, not just in India, but in other places of the world as well. And since we're talking about the extension of experiences, I think anyway we are out of time, and I would like to end this discussion by quoting one of my favorite characters from The Lord of the Rings. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it. And with this, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. You can either raise your hands or put the questions in the chat box.
I thought you were going to quote Smorg.
Sorry?
I thought you were going to quote Smorg.
So we have a question from Ranjana. Are there cultural beliefs on gharial in India?
That's a very good question, because I've been searching for that myself. Ma Ganga is sometimes depicted riding on a gharial in certain temples, for example, near the Chambal. So there is some association with the gharial and Ma Ganga. But other than that, very little actually. As far as I know, I mean, it would take a lot of searching probably through, the holy literatures to find something more. But I can't really answer that very well.
We have a question from Anindya Sinha. Rana, are you able to unmute?
Yeah, sure. I think Sunil had his hand before mine.
Sure. Sunil, you'll be able to unmute if you want to ask a question directly. Rana, maybe you can go ahead.
Oh, sure. So thank you very much, Rom and Simon. It was fascinating to listen to both of you. And Rom has, of course, been an inspirational figure for me, a close friend. And I've been reading so much of your work, Simon. Thank you very much. My own interest has been in cognition, in non-human cognition. And one of the aspects that I think has really been neglected in non-human interactions, relationship studies is what about the perspective of the non-human themselves, right? How do they approach these relationships? What is it that they would like? How do they take decisions? How much of these decisions are based on knowledge that they have gained from these interactions? So, this is something that I've been trying to address to a certain extent with macaques and elephants that I've been working on. But I was just wondering whether you think there are ways in which we could address these kind of questions, really looking at it from the other perspectives with crocodiles.
Yeah, Rana, you've got a fantastic point there, and I think I touched upon it by saying that what we do to the crocodile seems to be reflected about what they do to us. So there seems to be something much more going on than we realize. Unfortunately, reptiles are kind of like creatures from a different planet as compared to mammals. We've got a tremendous advantage. You've got a tremendous advantage with macaques because their facial features, their sounds and so on can, at least to some degree, be interpreted by you, by whoever's studying them. Whereas a crocodile, when he's happy, he looks like this. When he's sad, he looks like this. When he's angry, he looks like this. And, there's not much character to sort of analyze or to try to figure things out. But it's a very good point you're making. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in that behavioral studies of reptiles have been very slow. It's only the last 5 to 10 years that people have realized there's a lot to learn about reptile cognition. And one example I heard was that the reason that reptiles were universally assumed to be stupid was that laboratory experiments are done in labs and they always cool them. And of course, what happens to a reptile when it shuts down? So of course they all seem stupid. The thing is, what I think is quite one way into this, Aninja, is learning about the ways in which animals and people communicate their intentions. So it's kind of cross-species communication, and whether reptiles do this, I don't know. You could think of rattlesnakes or, cobras standing up. Whether there are certain signals, crocodiles, some of them show aggression by hunching their backs or, sticking their tails up. There is perhaps a kind of visual language that we could learn a little bit about. I mean, if a big Nile crocodile comes charging across the river at you on the surface, he's saying, push off, this is my river. If he wants to eat you, you're not going to see him come across the river until he's got you. So, perhaps there's something to be said for trying to look for examples of this kind of, but the bottom line is studying humans and animals maybe together, how they're interacting as a community instead of anthropologists studying people and ethologists, ethnologists studying people and ethologists studying animals.
We have an interesting question by Gopi Hari in the chat. I want to start rescuing crocodiles because they're getting hurt near my hometown, Shimoga, in the Tunga River. Let me know what certificates I should get to do this legally.
Probably he shouldn't be asking about certificates at this stage, but what is the point of rescuing them? Because they do live in the Tunga and the Badra and the Tungabhadra Reservoir as well. We know that. And what happens is, of course, during any river system which has been messed up by a dam, there'll be periods when there'll be a lot of flooding and there'll be periods when it's totally dry. And the crocodiles respond sometimes by moving to places where they're not welcome. So yes, there are some circumstances where the croc does have to be rescued and put back. But whoever it is who's asking this question has to go to the forest department and prove himself to the forest department before they would allow anything like this. This is a Schedule 1 species under the Wildlife Act. You can't touch it unless you have the permit from the forest department.
True. Shri Krishna Badami is asking, Mr. Whitaker has been working in India for a very long time now. What is his observations on how climate change has affected reptile habitat, especially in the Malnad region of Karnataka?
Oh boy, that's an interesting question. I don't have the data to be able to answer anything intelligent about that, but people often asked about a very interesting aspect of reptile ecology is that the eggs of turtles and crocodiles and other reptiles are, the sex is not genetically determined, it's determined by the temperature at which they're incubating. So what about climate change? If they're too warm, we're going to produce all males or all females, depending on what species it is. And then what's going to happen to the species? But a very kind, a very knowledgeable ecologist told me that these reptiles have been around for many millions of years, and the world has seen many climate changes over those millions of years, and they're still with us. Crocodiles were here 180 million years ago, and they're still with us. So I don't think we have to worry too much about it. On a local level, if Agumbe starts getting less rain, in fact, if it only gets 4,000 millimeters instead of 8,000 millimeters at present, it's not going to change things too much for king cobras, for example, because they're also in fairly dry forests as well. So the question is a complex one. I mean, I would say the answers to it are very complex, but it's a good question.
Shiva Kumar Pagad is asking, does reintroduction lead to conflict in New World's coexistence, or is it a reintroduction of culture itself?
Could you read me that one again?
Yeah. Does reintroduction lead to conflicts in New World's coexistence, or is it a reintroduction of culture itself?
Reintroductions. I'm not sure I understand it exactly, but reintroductions, this is something that happens with rewilding a lot. It's generally the case that it's much more difficult to introduce or reintroduce species to places where people don't have lived experience of being with them. And if you like, that is then a cultural loss, that what we were talking about, experience, extinction of experience. So I would say that needs to be done first, the preparation of the ground, if you like. I wrote a chapter on invasions of the invasion of the crocodile, which was supposedly happening in Australia. And of course, they wiped out most of their crocs with hunting in the post-war years. And so kids who grew up in the 70s and 80s didn't have crocs in many of the rivers where they used to be, but they had successful conservation from the 70s, and these crocs come back. So people see them as invaders, but they're not. They're coming back to where they were. But culturally, for people, this is a real loss and a difficult thing. They grew up swimming in those rivers, and now there's crocodiles. So it's interesting. I guess maybe one thing to say is, people don't just see these animals as biological animals. So yes, there's a cultural impact and a biological impact for introducing or reintroducing species. There's a history to consider.
Yeah, it's very true. So it's 1 hour now. Simon and Rom, do you have some time to take a few more questions? Because we have a lot of questions in our chat box.
I'm happy if Simon is.
Yeah. Sure, I can take a few more.
Okay. So Dev Patel is asking if you can suggest some good ways to get involved with crocodile conservation, specifically keeping in mind like young undergrad students.
Yeah, one opportunity that's offered by the Madras Crocodile Bank is volunteering, and they can contact the Madras, just volunteers at madrascrocodilebank.org and get the details about it. For one thing, it might be a bit mundane to go and sort of clean out croc pens and stuff like that. But the point is, it'll put that person in touch with other people working with crocs and open up just maybe what they need to find out. That's my suggestion.
Yeah. Kritika Bhave is asking, how about the crocodiles in Bitakanika, Orissa? Do you have any comments on human-crocodile conflict interactions there? The locals there are sort of scared of crocodiles due to few old conflict incidents. Is this important, according to you, to have this fear in order to live in harmony in shared spaces?
This is the whole Bitakanika scene is very interesting. For one thing, there are many more crocodiles there in that relatively small national park as compared to the Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove swamp in the world. And they're very visible, and they are definitely coming out of the protected area into people's, even into people's farmlands and stuff like that, especially in the monsoon when there's a lot of interconnected rivers and tributaries. So it is, yeah, and saltwater crocodiles are very different from mugger. They seem to be, I don't like to use the word aggressive with these animals, but they are definitely an animal which doesn't necessarily respect human beings the way muggers do, that humans are fair prey. And I can really appreciate the fact that people are scared to have saltwater crocodiles around. There is quite a bit of work by the Forest Department, for one thing, keeping people out of the national park, which is very important because that's where people would be most at risk. And there is some capture and translocation of animals. But to be very honest with you, I don't see where it's going to go because these crocodile population continues to grow. And I have been an advocate of sustainable use of wildlife. I'm not going to open that can of worms now, but there seems to be that Australia has done the same thing as Simon just told us. The population of crocodiles in Australia has increased to such a degree that the commercial utilization of crocodiles is now an accepted way to go in certain provinces like the Northern Territories, for example, which has a very large crocodile industry. It's $1 million industry. And this is perfectly logical. India won't allow it, of course, because we don't have any chance of starting a utilization of wildlife. There's too much opposition against it. But what is the answer? Just to give you an example, the Andaman Islands is seeing a rather rapid increase of crocodiles and crocodile attacks. And this is, again, the saltwater crocodile. And what is the answer? They can't just keep catching crocodiles and putting them into pens. They'll very soon become totally overcrowded. And you can't translocate them because, man, these things can swim 100 or 200 kilometers through the sea and get back to where they were originally captured. So it is, this question has opened up. I mean, I'm not going to say a can of worms again, but it's a huge subject which has to be dealt with and by the wildlife managers. It's a difficult one, a very difficult one.
Yeah, very true. Akansha Pandey, this is not a question, but she is sharing some of her experience with working with crocodiles. She's saying, adding on to the points made by Ram and Simon on cognition, during my fieldwork in Goa, a few fishermen went ahead on saying that muggers are really smart animals through their lifetime of experiences of sharing space with them. Yeah. We have a question from Sujata Bhagat, who's asking, what is your take on Gangaram, the 130-year-old crocodile in Chhattisgarh who died recently in 2019? He was adored by people who lived on the banks of the river, a great example of cohabitation.
Yeah, well, that's another example, similar to Charotar, but in this case, an individual animal. Even more spectacular is the vegetarian crocodile who died in a temple in Kerala recently, I think last year or year before last. He was apparently fed with curd rice for the last 20 years of his life. No wonder he died. They called him a vegetarian crocodile, but he lived in a pond full of fish. So I can just imagine how much of a vegetarian he really was.
I mean,
Uh,
it brings up a point. Sometimes there are well-meaning beliefs which are possibly unsafe, like in Charitar, the idea that these crocodiles live on dung, because when it's cold, the dung heat hold the warmth, so they go and lie next to them. But the idea that these are vegetarian crocodiles is probably not the best, not necessarily the safest idea.
yeah. No, but Simon, then where do you draw the line? I mean, both Simon and Rom, that when there is this cohabitation where people love these animals and they want to do something for them, but if they are doing something which is not sort of which will not benefit the animals, then how do you draw the line? How do you manage these situations? It becomes really complex.
If it's a wild situation, it's one thing. The crocodile is probably going to live fine. I visited several times a shrine, a Sufi shrine in Bangladesh called Ganjahan Ali Mazar. And there they had been overfeeding a pair of mugger crocodiles, and they fed them to their death ultimately. And so this is a captive situation where the crocodiles, because people like to see them and get the so-called blessing from them, they were feeding them way too much, and ultimately they ended up killing them.
Sorry, go ahead, Simon.
I was just going to say that I think what's been interesting for me in this is, if you work on snakes and crocodiles, a lot of the work or the interest is in outside of protected areas where they're living with people and people are living with them. And there is a little bit of a bias in conservation towards wilderness and wild animals. We don't really like animals that are interacting with people, that are habituated to people, and somehow they're not quite as good. They're not quite wild. People want to be out there on the Serengeti with the lion, the wild lion. They're not so sure about the places where people are interacting, and I think that's just wrong. I think actually where conservation needs to be at is exactly in all those places where people are cohabiting, and things like climate change, which we've mentioned, growing population, all the rest of it, are pushing animals and people together more and more. We're seeing them showing up in cities. In Vadodara, they're famously crocodiles, and a bunch of cities in Amazonia. In Rio de Janeiro, there are crocodiles in the outskirts now. So that's where we need to figure out, how things work.
Yeah.
True. Anirudh Vasawa is asking that, so VNC is doing whatever it can to maintain and promote tolerance among locals in Charota, from creating awareness in school children to building a network of Croc Guardian of local youth to running a citizen science program to promote awareness among the urban populace. But I'm always afraid that this tolerance may not last long. I'm looking for something that says this method works. Any idea of what is that ultimate strategy?
Nice to hear from Anirudh.
Definitely.
Guys do such fantastic work. I think in some respects you have some evidence from where you are, actually, that what you do is helpful. I do think part of our project right now in the IUCN, the specialist group on human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, is trying to collect examples like yours of coexistence with different species in different places and learn from that. We don't actually know enough, and I have a lot of colleagues who push back the conflict guys and say, you guys are a bunch of hippies. It's a lovely story, but actually in reality things are tough. You guys are just romantics, and I don't believe that's the case, but we need to accumulate more evidence. We need to study this stuff, and it's different. It's a different kind of, exactly the sorts of projects, Yashendu, that you've been talking about doing. This is a research need, I'd say, right now. We need evidence for this stuff.
And an ability to replicate the same kind of thing in other places. I mean, Yashendu, you've already mentioned that there are other parts of India where things look a lot better than they did in terms of human-crocodile relationships. And a really good documentary film. I know some small videos have been made from Chatata area, but a really good, hard-hitting documentary film and plenty of writing and plenty of publicity would really help a lot. A continuous flow of publicity, because every example, particularly getting local people involved and interviewing local people and their feelings about it. This is magical, and people really respond to that.
Yeah. Those narratives. We were plotting an issue, as you know, Rom, in Current Conservation, a special issue on coexistence, and this is exactly right, trying to communicate these stories and tell narratives in ways people can relate to.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, very true. So we are way over time and we have so many more questions, but I don't think we'll have time to address all the questions. But I would like to just ask one more questions from budding herpetologists across India. A lot of people are asking that how can they get into this field and how can they help in crocodile conservation in the future? How can they be a part of research, and sort of how can they pursue this for their career? Maybe like Rom and Simon can say like 2 lines for this.
I mean, I certainly welcome people to write to me, and I do try to answer everyone who writes to me, and I might be able to offer some suggestions. The idea of volunteering at the Croc Bank is one good option, and so you can let my email ID out for whoever wants to write, and I surely will write and answer whatever I can, whatever suggestion I have.
Sure.
I'm from, I'm not based in India. I'd say, Rom, the work they do at Madras, the people like the VNC, I know they tried with an app. They're looking to involve people more widely across the country. I think getting into that kind of observation, trying to, you can see where interventions are being tried, these crocodile exclusion enclosures. I'm very intrigued by these things. I mean, they're universally recommended and seldom work. I'm interested in why they don't work. So a really easy thing I would love people to do is to, if there's one nearby, observe it. Who uses it? Who doesn't use it?
Yeah.
Talk to people. Like, why? Is it a caste thing? Is it age? Is it gender? Why do some people use it or other people not use it? This is potentially an obvious logical, of course, if you maintain it, and that's another question.
That's the other question. Yeah.
So, and if people do, why not? Do people feel ownership, or do they think it's the forest department? We have a pretty well worked out set of interventions now for crocs, but they vary a lot by region, which I find interesting, and they are very little evaluated. We really could benefit from, that kind of research. And of course, watching crocs, how crocs behave around where people are. Don't forget the animal behavior studies. That's very valuable. What are the crocs doing where there's livestock and people and fish?
Yeah.
True. Thank you, Simon and Rom. And I'd like to apologize to all the people whose questions were not covered in the interest of time. But maybe you can reach out to Rom and Simon independently and ask them questions if you want to. I would like to thank both Rom and Simon on behalf of CWS and also the Wild Chronicles team. And this was a really fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. And definitely, I have so many new ideas after this discussion, which I'm sure I'll write to you independently about that. But thanks a lot for joining us today. And I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Great. Thanks very much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
All the best. See you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Bye.
Bye.